You might remember, just before Christmas on the beach over there, I said that I would never review kit that I hadn't bought or borrowed myself. Well, Panasonic have lent me their new GH6. Yeah, I know. In my defence, I obviously don't get to keep it. There are no gifts involved, and sadly, they haven't offered any money. What Panasonic have said though, is there's absolutely no strings attached. I can say whatever I like about this camera. In fact, they also said I didn't even have to make a video. They've lent me this camera and I don't even have to review it. So I won't. This is definitely not a review of the brand new LUMIX GH6. Ta-da! Thing is, a lot of people have been waiting a long time for this GH6. I know, I'm one of them. We thought it was going to happen when the GH5 Mark II came out, and I'm still not sure what that's all about. But now expectations are running sky high, and although I'm definitely not going to review this camera, I know many of you would like to take a closer look. First thing to say, the GH6 will immediately feel familiar to Lumix users, which is a good thing. The buttons are all in the right place, exactly where you expect them to be, but it's a fair bit chunkier than the GH5. Bit heavier too. Not in a bad way though. In my large hands with sausage fingers, I think I prefer the feel of this GH6 to any other GH camera I've used. The grip is larger, but gives me a lot more confidence when hand holding. It's obvious that some of this extra size comes from the addition of a fan behind the swivel monitor. This looks like exactly the same arrangement as the S1H, where the monitor can tilt away from the camera body as well as swivel. And just like the S1H, I've not heard this fan at all. I know some people might be worried by the addition of a fan, and I'm told that if you want to build a camera with this much power and no fan, you either have to have recording time limits or make the camera physically much larger to accommodate a big heatsink. This camera has no recording time limits at all. However, the design is a neat arrangement because it moves your monitor screen away from the sockets on the side. And yes, it's got a full-size HDMI, which is very welcome. No camera that really wants to be taken seriously should have those mini or micro HDMIs. They're the devil's work and they'll always break at the worst possible time. On the other side, we've now got one SD UHS card slot and one CF Express Type B card slot, which gives us a clue as to what potential data rates are now going to be available. Panasonic have got rid of that silly little button on the back of the hand grip, you know, the one we always used to press by accident. Now we've got a couple of function buttons on the front, along with a big red record button for self-shooters. There's also a nice bright red tally lamp on the front for them as well. When I think about the GH5, I tend to think of it as a mirrorless stills camera that happens to shoot great video. And that all changed with the GH5S, which is a great video camera that happens to shoot stills. But when I think about this GH6, this feels more like an updated GH5S on steroids. This feels like a video camera, and that's not a bad thing. It's amazing when you think back to the hacked GH2 that started us all down this video journey. But that's how the GH6 feels to me. But what does it look like on paper? Well, obviously, this isn't a review, so if you want a full list of all the detailed specifications, you'd be much better off reading them online or going to one of those channels that specialise in expert reviews. However, I have compiled a short list of the video highlights. We've got a new 25.2 megapixel sensor and a new Venus processing engine with twice the power. It's got high precision 3D noise reduction, but I don't know what that is. And we've now got the full-fat V-Log V-Gamut from the Varicams included as standard, with user-loadable LUTs too. We now have 48 kHz 24-bit audio, and 4 channels are possible if you add the XLR adapter. There's also a firmware update coming which will give you raw output over HDMI and direct recording to SSDs through the USB-C connector. As far as the video formats we've now got, I can't list them all, there's too many. But we can now record 5.7K up to 30p in ProRes, 422 or 422HQ. Yep, that's right, you can now record ProRes internally. We've also got 5.7K up to 60p in 420, 5.8K up to 30p in anamorphic 4x3 mode. And yes, you can now de-squeeze the anamorphic display. 4K up to 60p in 422, 4K up to 120p in 420, and Full HD at 240p in 422, and Full HD in 300 frames per second in 420 if you're using variable frame rates. These are even more amazing figures when I tell you that every single one of them is recorded in 10-bit. The camera still has some 8-bit modes, but not many, and I'm not sure why they're there. It'll also record interlaced, but I think that's for the newsboys who are stuck in the 1980s. I counted 93 different video modes, codecs, frame rates, different compressions, and at first sight it's quite a daunting choice. Luckily, you can set up a quick menu of only those formats you use regularly, which makes switching modes much easier. Apparently, the GH6 has over 12 stops of dynamic range when shooting the full-fat vlog. Now, I've no way of testing dynamic range accurately, and this is not a review. But I was able to go down to my usual spot and do the usual check of the shadows, and it certainly looks impressive. We've also got a new dynamic boost mode, which gives potentially more than 13 stops of dynamic range. And wow, this does look good. The dynamic boost mode is very clever. It merges images from two separate ISOs, or as I prefer to call them, gain circuits. You've got your low gain, which has high saturation and protected highlights, and then you've got your high gain, which is essentially a luminance data and protected shadows. Merge them together and you get more dynamic range. Very smart. The only downside is that if you're using two separate ISOs or gain circuits, these need to be set a little way apart, which means the minimum usable ISO is going to be higher than normal. For instance, if you're shooting vlog with dynamic boost mode, then your minimum ISO is ISO 2000, which means you're going to need a pretty large bag of ND filters along with you as well. Talking of ISO, I also went at night to shoot the pier, as I usually do, just to get a feeling for the noise levels off the sensor. And I must say, it looks very clean. When I've tried this on my old GH5, I never really liked going much above 1600 ISO. The GH5S improved this quite a lot, and at a push I could go all the way up to 6400. But to me, the GH6 looks cleaner than both of those. All the usual Lumix colour profiles are here, including the lovely Cinelite D2 and V2 modes. And I've always loved the Panasonic colour science. Actually, in this world of log and raw, the phrase colour science has become a little outdated and probably misleading. We should maybe call it default internal picture profile. Anyway, Panasonic's default look has always impressed. Great in-body stabilization is something else that Panasonic got quite the reputation for, and apparently this has been improved on the GH6. We now have a new gyro sensor and new algorithms which apparently give us 7.5 stops of in-body stabilization. Now, I've no idea what 7.5 stops means to us video shooters, but I tried hand holding on the longest lens I had and it worked very well. As a side note, with all of these IBIS systems, from every manufacturer, there's a potential issue when you're using very wide lenses, and you notice it in the corners. If the sensor is floating around a very wide lens, then the distortion from the lens moves across your frame, resulting in a strange warpy effect. So if you're hand holding very wide lenses, it's often better to turn stabilization off. On paper, the technical specifications of the GH6 are pretty much state-of-the-art, and they are a huge technological leap forward over the GH5. But I know what you really want to know. Has the autofocus system also improved? Well, bad news, it's still a contrast-based depth from defocus system. And I have to be really careful here because I took a lot of heat from saying that the DFD system in the S5 was good. I think I called it usable for video. And this angered a lot of YouTubers who like running zigzags around fields trying to show how bad it was. But I stand by my findings, and I think that the S5 contrast-based system was a big improvement. So the question now is, do we also see, hopefully, an even bigger improvement in the GH6? Well, I did all my usual tests, which mainly involved focusing on humans, because vloggers just want to look at themselves, don't they? And it was immediately obvious that this autofocus has noticeably improved, in all modes and with all settings. Maybe it's the faster readout from the sensor, or the speed of the processor, or the improved algorithms. I've no idea. But this does seem to track my face more reliably. I also tried sitting stationary for ages, looking to spot that pulsing or hunting in the background light that you normally get from DFD systems. And I was pleasantly surprised. This autofocus is totally different from the GH5 and shows big improvements over the S5. Strangely though, it did seem better at tracking my movement towards the camera than when I moved backwards. It would still focus on me eventually, it just took longer when I walked backwards, which is odd. Maybe the algorithms need a tweak. I know I'll get more hate from saying this, but I'm going to say it again. I think this autofocus system is usable for video. Is it perfect? No. Is it what we wanted? No. But it is noticeably better. The problem I have here is that you can't help but wonder why Panasonic won't give us phase detect. I did ask, and the official line was that phase detect can affect the ultimate picture quality, and that's not a compromise that Panasonic wanted to make. I would argue that what's the point of picture quality if everything's out of focus? And I have a real problem here arguing about autofocus because I've spent a long career perfecting the art of manually focusing. And I would be telling everybody who would listen exactly why autofocus couldn't possibly work professionally. The trouble is that once you've used really good autofocus, it's very hard to do without it. Anyway, this is not a review, and I'm not going to tell you whether the GH6 autofocus system is good enough for your use. I'm also not going to presume to tell you whether to buy this camera. But this camera does raise some interesting questions, and the obvious first one is, in this full-frame world, is there still a market for micro four thirds sensors at all? Well, I think there is, and not just to existing GH5 owners or people who've collected a lot of micro four thirds lenses, but also anybody who's, say, shooting news or documentaries or wildlife or anything where the advantages of a smaller sensor and a longer potential focal range are obvious. Now, I'm told that most people shooting video own more than one camera, and that makes a lot of sense. And in that context, the GH6 would make a fantastic companion to any full-frame camera, or even a VariCam, or the S1H. The hardest thing to explain is how this camera makes you feel. There's something about the build quality, the placement of each button, the shape, that makes it easy to capture great footage. Dare I even say it, it's fun to use. I suspect only owners of the GH5 will know what I'm talking about. I think you can probably tell that I've really enjoyed not reviewing this GH6. It's like my GH5 but on steroids. And I think for a lot of people this will be close to being their perfect camera. I was upset to learn that Panasonic have not ruled out using phase detect sometime in the future. But it's 5 years since the GH5 was launched, and in that time Panasonic have known that phase detect is all we really wanted to see in the GH6. I'm upset because now was the time to do it. They were that close from producing the perfect camera. Thanks for watching.